everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading State of War, the secret history of the CIA and the Bush administration. If you enjoy the show, please do hit the like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 3. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pronouncing this casus belli. Could be wrong. Casus belli. I'm going with it. Two kinds of trouble developed inside the American national security apparatus under George W. Bush. One came because the president personally and directly authorized new operations like the NSA's domestic surveillance program that almost certainly would never have been approved under normal circumstances and that raised serious legal or political questions. The second kind of trouble came because of the fervored climate created throughout the government by the president and his senior advisors. Bush sent signals of what he wanted done without explicit presidential orders. The most ambitious got the message. Decision-making was short-circuited. It was this climate that influenced the handling of detainees, eroding the standards of the humane treatment of prisoners that had guided the United States through its modern history. But there were other equally troubling ways in which Bush indirectly transformed the national security bureaucracy. The event that, more than any other, prompted this warping was the Iraq War. It pitted the Defense Department against the CIA, and factions within the CIA against one another. Eventually, war fever spread down through the ranks. At the very highest level, the personal relationship between the leaders of the Department of Defense and those of the Central Intelligence Agency during the first few years of the Bush administration was fine. Quite smooth, actually. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and CIA Director George Tenet met regularly throughout much of President Bush's first term, over lunch at the Pentagon with only a few aides in attendance, and the two got along amicably. Tenet never developed the kind of warm and friendly relationship with Rumsfeld that he enjoyed with President Bush, or even with Secretary of State Colin Powell. Like Tenet, a product of New York City, but perhaps that would have been asking too much. One of the biggest reasons that the Tenet-Rumsfeld relationship was so cordial was that Tenet seemed intimidated, or at least outmaneuvered, by Rumsfeld, and rarely challenged him on festering problems between the Pentagon and the intelligence community. Tenet and Rumsfeld would sometimes chat about the latest White House meeting they had attended, or Tenet would regale Rumsfeld with stories and anecdotes culled from current spy cases in the Directorate of Operations, the CIA's clandestine espionage arm. Yet, Tenet avoided raising some of the most pressing issues that officials at the CIA and other intelligence agencies desperately felt needed to be resolved with the Secretary of Defense, who, after all, controlled roughly 80% of the U.S. intelligence community's budget. Before each lunch, Tenet's aides would prepare a list of talking points covering problems to be addressed with Rumsfeld, but Tenet would often ignore the list and skip over the tough issues. If Tenet asked Rumsfeld for help on a particular problem that could not be ignored, spy satellite programs, for example, Rumsfeld would usually give it to him, but Tenet seemed to press only on issues that he knew would not lead to conflict. Tenet had no appetite for waging bitter and drawn-out interagency battles, particularly against an experienced heavyweight infighter like Rumsfeld, who had been Secretary of Defense for President Gerald Ford when Tenet was still an undergraduate at Georgetown. Perhaps he thought it was better to humor Rumsfeld with colorful storytelling and stand clear of his wrath than get down and dirty with him over turf battles that Tenet was doomed to lose. Rumsfeld enjoyed Tenet's company, although at one lunch Rumsfeld personally upbraided Tenet in front of several others for using the F word while a woman was present, leading to a few awkward moments, according to someone who was present. Yet at the end of some of these sessions, there was a sense, at least on the Department of Defense's side, that the lunch hadn't accomplished much of substance. On these occasions, after Tenet and his aides departed, Rumsfeld would turn to an aide and ask about the relevance of the spy tales and other intelligence-related anecdotes that Tenet had just spun out for him. "Do I really need to know that stuff?" Rumsfeld would ask. "No, Mr. Secretary, you didn't," would be the reply. George would spend most of the time telling him anecdotes. He would talk to him about operational stuff from the DO, like this guy is talking to that guy, telling him names and places, recalled one Rumsfeld aide. Tenet was trying to impress him, one former Tenet aide acknowledged. George Tenet was hardly the only senior official in the Bush administration to be intimidated and buffaloed by Donald Rumsfeld. Early in the Bush administration, Rumsfeld made it clear that he didn't plan on taking orders from the National Security Council at the White House. He worked for George W. Bush, not Condoleezza Rice or her subordinates. If the president wanted him to do something, he could say so himself. On the NSC staff, On the NSC staff, there soon developed a strong belief that Rumsfeld had told his aides at the Pentagon that they too could ignore directions from the NSC. Eventually, it became clear that Condoleezza Rice could not rein in the Pentagon in order to get its leadership to adhere to the normal interagency processes that kept Washington running on track. It also became clear that Rumsfeld and his top aides were not paying a price for flouting the White House on key policy issues. The dominant power relationship was between Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney, who in effect was the president's real national security advisor. Rumsfeld had been Dick Cheney's mentor and boss long before the younger man became vice president. To others in the administration, mystified by the process, or lack of a process, it eventually became evident that Cheney and Rumsfeld had a back channel where the real decision-making was taking place, and that larger meetings were often irrelevant. The result was that the Bush administration was the first presidency in modern history in which the Pentagon served as the overwhelming center of gravity for U.S. foreign policy. Condi was a very, very weak national security advisor, observed one former NSC staffer who worked for her. She didn't seem close to the president, but that really didn't translate into having, she did seem close to the president, but that really didn't translate into having control over the process. The NSC process in this administration has been dysfunctional. You had a set of principals who were polarized on almost every issue. That means you either have to forge a consensus or tee up options and make decisions. And your job as NSC advisor is to get the president to make decisions. But she let the dysfunction and lack of consensus continue. Rumsfeld was subject to no adult supervision by the National Security Advisor. A former top CIA official agreed, "I think Rice didn't really manage anything and will go down as probably the worst National Security Advisor in history. I think the real National Security Advisor was Cheney, and so Cheney and Rumsfeld could do what they wanted." After 9/11, the structural problems in the Bush administration came into much sharper focus, leading to radical and sudden shifts in American foreign policy. Under normal conditions, new policy initiatives undergo months, if not years, of study and deliberation in the government's national security apparatus. Cabinet departments and other agencies, often with very different institutional interests, get to have their say on how to shape new proposals, and interagency meetings are held to hash out differences. Congressional leaders often have input, as do lobbyists for major industries and sometimes even ambassadors from foreign countries that might be affected. In the process, compromises are made and sharp edges are smoothed. If things go well, by the time a proposal gets to the president and his most senior advisors, it tends to represent something close to a consensus, and policy gets forced toward the center. The national security bureaucracy is maddeningly slow, lacks creativity, and is risk-averse. It is ill-suited to fight a nimble enemy in a war on terrorism that is clear to anyone who reads the 9/11 Commission report, which describes how proposals to deal with Al-Qaeda languished in bureaucratic hell during the Clinton administration and in the first few months of the Bush administration. Yet this creaking process does serve one purpose. It tends to weed out really stupid or dangerous ideas, unethical or even immoral ideas, ideas that could get people killed or could even start wars. After 9/11, the moderating influences of the slow-moving bureaucracy were stripped away. The president and his principals, Don Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, and a handful of others, held almost constant crisis atmosphere meetings, making decisions on the fly, instead of proposals gradually rising up through the normal layers of government. They were introduced and imposed from above. Debate was short-circuited. Interagency reviews of new initiatives were conducted on the run. The bureaucracy fell far behind the political leadership on a wide array of policy initiatives. During the 18 months between the September 11th attacks and the March 2003 invasion of Iraq, the bureaucrats never caught up. In that intense atmosphere, the political leaders within the administration, with the clearest answers and the greatest certainty and the most persistence, were quickly able to dominate the agenda. It was a perfect environment for Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld's ascendancy led to endless heartaches and personnel turnover, particularly at the NSC. Rumsfeld, for example, concluded that he didn't have to pay any attention to the counterterrorism coordinator at the White House, since he believed that fighting the global war on terrorism was his job. Rumsfeld even wrote a memo to President Bush saying that he thought the job of counterterrorism coordinator at the NSC shouldn't exist, and that he believed that the position was actually unconstitutional, according to former NSC officials familiar with the issue. The president may not have agreed with Rumsfeld's interpretation of the Constitution, but the defense secretary was successful in severely limiting the power and influence of the NSC over military, counterterrorism, and even intelligence matters. It was no coincidence that after 9/11, White House counterterrorism coordinators came and went with dizzying speed. The job was eventually downgraded and merged with that of the White House Coordinator for Homeland Security Matters. There were many times the Pentagon did just what it wanted, no matter what the NSC said one former White House aide. An effective network of officials with long-standing ties to Cheney, some neoconservative, others simply conservative, scattered throughout key jobs in the administration, provided crucial support to Rumsfeld. It was Rumsfeld's force of personality, his willingness to act as an enabler for the neoconservatives within the Department of Defense and elsewhere in the administration, combined with the enthusiastic support he received from Cheney, that did so much to break down the normal checks and balances in the national security apparatus. If Rumsfeld was willing to ignore the president's national security advisor, then why not ignore the director of the CIA? In fact, when it came to intelligence matters, it seemed as if Rumsfeld had sized up Tenet and had decided he could run right over him. George Tenet liked to talk about how he was a tough Greek from Queens, but in reality, he was a pussy, complained one former Tenet lieutenant roughly. He just wanted people to like him. So when Rumsfeld began to propose a series of initiatives that directly challenged Tenet's power and influence over the intelligence community, particularly after 9/11, it was not very surprising that Tenet shrank back, or that the White House was absent from the field of bureaucratic battle. Rumsfeld had come into office eager to reform the hidebound Pentagon. Transforming the military was to be Rumsfeld's signature issue, and among his projects he included the maze of military intelligence agencies that were components of the Department of Defense. He told aides that when it came to intelligence, he wanted one dog to kick ass, meaning that he wanted one dog to kick, meaning that he wanted a top advisor who could streamline and consolidate the Pentagon's sprawling intelligence empire and help him bring it under his direct control. Really, because it just sounds like he wanted somebody to be mean to me. Years before President Bush and Congress finally agreed in the heart of the closing days of the 2004 presidential campaign to create a new director of national intelligence, Rumsfeld was eagerly drawing up his own unilateral reorganization of the intelligence bureaucracy. The difference was, of course, that his plans called for the consolidation of power over the intelligence apparatus within the office of the Secretary of Defense. There was no need for a new director of national intelligence when the nation already had Don Rumsfeld. Rich Haver, the man who had worked behind the scenes to try to get Tenet ousted during the Bush transition, was now Rumsfeld's top intelligence aide. He was placed in charge of the reorganization effort, which immediately raised red flags at the CIA. Rumsfeld's plan for one dog to kick turned into a proposal to create an intelligence czar within the Pentagon who would oversee all intelligence agencies in the Department of Defense budget, including the National Security Agency, the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, later named the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which processes and analyzes spy satellite photography. The Defense Intelligence Agency and the intelligence arms of each major military service. That meant just about everything in the intelligence community except the CIA and the State Department's Small Intelligence Branch. Rumsfeld told Haver that he wanted to make certain that Tenet accepted the plan. Rumsfeld said it couldn't just be something that Tenet acquiesced to, but it actually had to be something he approved. So Haver took the plan to Tenet, and the CIA director responded flatly that it looks as if you're trying to do my job, as Haver recalled. Haver dutifully went back and modified the proposed reorganization, scaling back the degree to which it cut into CIA directors' control over the collection of intelligence from spies, spy satellites, and listening posts. Haver took it back to Tenet, and this time the CIA director did give his blessing. Tenet refused to resist any further, despite loud cries from members of his senior staff and even from Brent Scowcroft, the former national security advisor in the first Bush administration, who was serving as the chairman of the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Scowcroft had known Rumsfeld for 30 years, since the Nixon and Ford administrations, and he knew better than almost anyone else in modern Washington how Rumsfeld operated. Scowcroft felt sure that this was just the start of Rumsfeld's empire building. Scowcroft also saw Rumsfeld's initiative as a direct assault on the traditional role of the Director of Central Intelligence. Ever since the CIA was created by the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA director has had two distinct jobs. One as the head of the CIA, and the other as the overall boss of the entire intelligence community made up of some 15 agencies. This second function has always been ill-defined, mainly because the budgetary power of the Director of Central Intelligence did not extend much beyond the CIA, and without control over the purse strings, it was hard to issue orders to other agencies. Since most of the intelligence budget was buried within Pentagon spending, it was critical that the CIA director work well with the Defense Secretary. In the past, that had usually not been a major problem for the CIA director because the Secretary of Defense almost always had more important things to worry about than the 10% or less of the Pentagon budget that involved intelligence matters. There had, of course, been disputes, but in modern history there had never been a Secretary of Defense who also lusted after the job of Director of Central Intelligence. At least not until Rumsfeld. Tenet refused to heed Scowcroft's warnings. Former aides say that Tenet never showed much interest in intelligence reform or reorganization. His top priorities were maintaining a strong relationship with the president and running the Directorate of Operations. Tenet rarely expressed much interest in efforts to coordinate the entire intelligence community. In the end, he didn't object to the legislation, creating Rumsfeld's one dog to kick, otherwise known as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. The only surprise was that Haver didn't get the job. He had made many enemies and in the end was perhaps better suited to the role of agent provocateur than that of manager of a large bureaucracy. The job went instead to Rumsfeld's most trusted aide, Stephen Cambone, who had earlier been staff director of Rumsfeld's commission to assess ballistic missile threat to the United States. In his newly created position, Cambone, or maybe it's Camboni, looks Italian, Cambone would eventually become an even more controversial figure than Haver, and would face questions about his role in the development of policies concerning the U.S. military's handling of detainees in Iraq. Rumsfeld's desire to gain control over intelligence only intensified after 9/11, when he watched aghast as the CIA took the lead in Afghanistan, while the military was painfully slow to gear up for war there. Rumsfeld didn't want to take a back seat again, with Cambone at his side, began pushing for more aggressive activities by U.S. Special Forces and even more secretive and elite special operations teams in the Joint Special Operations Command. In Afghanistan, CIA paramilitary personnel had joined with Special Forces and Special Operations units to marry intelligence to muscle and firepower. Rumsfeld seemed to believe that in the future there was no reason the Pentagon couldn't handle such covert activities all by itself. There was also no reason that its operations had to be limited to combat zones, such as Afghanistan or even Iraq. Rumsfeld believed that the Pentagon should create clandestine teams that would be free to operate anywhere he chose. In the global war on terrorism, the entire world was a combat zone, and secret U.S. activities in otherwise peaceful and non-threatening countries like Niger could be justified as preparation of the battlefield. Rumsfeld's plans represent, and no, it didn't say anything about Niger. I just threw that in. Rumsfeld's plans represented a radical expansion of the Defense Department's existing espionage capabilities. The Defense Humint, H-U-M-I-N-T, Human Source Intelligence Service, a wing of the Defense Intelligence Agency, had for years done some limited clandestine intelligence work, but it had never been involved in the kind of high-risk operations that Rumsfeld had in mind for the secret units that he created. Unlike the clandestine service of the CIA, Rumsfeld's new covert units, given the benign-sounding name of Operational Support Elements, didn't fall under the government's existing rules governing covert action. Rules that required explicit presidential authorization and congressional notification. In fact, the Defense Department didn't seem to believe its special teams needed to tell anyone else in the government what they were doing, let alone coordinate their activities with the American ambassadors and CIA station chiefs in the countries in which they were planning to operate. Rumsfeld was creating his own private spy service, buried deep within the Pentagon's vast black budget, with little or no accountability. Before long, the State Department and CIA began to hear reports from ambassadors and station chiefs that special covert military teams were operating in Africa and elsewhere in the Third World. In some cases, the embassies discovered their activities only by accident or at second hand. Whenever CIA officials complained to the Pentagon, they were told that the failure to notify them of the operations was an oversight, and that the teams were simply conducting reconnaissance. The new cowboys at the Pentagon were clearly asking for trouble. In early 2005, trouble came. Members of an operational support element team working in Latin America killed a man outside a bar. The American personnel then failed to report the incident to the U.S. Embassy for several days. The incident has never been made public, but several officials familiar with the matter say it raises serious questions about the degree to which the Pentagon's new secret teams are being properly managed. Thanks for joining me. Hope you tune in to the next episode, and we will take a look at the rest of this chapter, maybe even finish it up. If you enjoyed the episode, hit that like and subscribe button. We'll see you next time.